Hey, so what I'm about to show is relevant for when you're trying to power an LED from uh, like a field, like the NFC field or some other remote power source that uses a magnetic field alternating. But you could use it for understanding a lot of other, power delivery situations like key charging or things like that. So I've got an oscilloscope set up here, and the vertical axis here, each one of these little squares is 1 volt. And I've got an NFC reader right here that's powered on, so there's a field coming out of it. And I've got some antennas here that are hooked up to the leads for my oscilloscope. So right now it's at a resting noise level. But when I bring this larger antenna close to the reader, you can see as I bring it closer and farther away, as it gets better coupling, the voltage that is induced into the antenna goes up. So I place it flat down. We're getting a peak-to-peak voltage of about 8 volts, 4 positive and 4 negative. But as I bring it in a worse coupling scenario, the voltage will go down. And you can imagine, if you're using a tag and you're approaching the reader, it's first going to get introduced at a low voltage. And it'll keep getting larger and larger voltage induced until it gets to a critical threshold where the chip or the LEDs have received enough power to activate. So at the beginning of an activation, like when they first begin to read, they're usually approaching the reader, and at some point they turn on, but they're at their lowest possible power setting when they turn on. And like a couple milliseconds later, you could bring them closer and they'll get more power, but they start out at their worst possible power state every time, no matter what. But you can bring them in, get them to whatever the ideal coupling is. So that's with a tag that's, half the size of the reader antenna. But let's try with a slightly smaller tag. Let me just switch to it now. So I've switched to this smaller antenna dimensions. So the coupling factor between the reader and the antenna is worse now because this one's much smaller than the reader antenna. It's not quite as small as what you would see with like an X series tag, but it's a similar shape, and I can also show you a difference that you wouldn't see with a flat tag. So if I were to lay this flat like the previous one, I can bring it in closer and closer until it's at its ideal coupling scenario. And even in the ideal coupling scenario, we're getting a peak-to-peak voltage of like that would be 3.6 volts, which is okay. If this was a regulated power supply like the MTAG I2C Plus, then you could reliably expect to see 3.1 volts regulated on the output because it's switching the negative portion of the waveform up to the positive side and then smoothing it. So 3.6 is more than high enough to be regulated down to 3.1, which is the target for most NTAG I2C Plus applications. But for an LED configuration, it is only experiencing one side of the voltage, either the positive or the negative, because it's a diode, and that's just how diodes work. They only conduct in one direction. So in this case, this thing, under this coupling scenario, is only experiencing 1.8 volts, period, for an LED. And for most LEDs, that's not enough, Another strange issue is that this is when the coil is laid flat, but in an X series implant, most often you're bringing the coil in with it oriented, with the coil windings laying flat on the antenna, like the reader antenna, And that's an even worse coupling scenario. So we're seeing like 0.8 volts positive, so 1.6 peak to peak. I turn it sideways and I'm not getting anything. So under this coupling scenario, yeah, it doesn't peak very high. And this is an even smaller, or I mean, an X series antenna would even be smaller than this. So you really have to optimize the build for a passive like LED implant that does not have a chip to run correctly, you know? So it requires a lot more design considerations.